In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful. Thank you all for attending this very special meeting. This particular meeting we've called Reflections for a Year of Genocide. I honestly did not think, is it now Timmy will know this better than me, Timmy at the back there, but I think it's about 425 days of a genocide. We're roughly around that point, and conceptually I tried to think about what is 425 days of a genocide. I mean, I can't even think of how long that is. And the only marker that I have is that the infamous date of the 7th of the 7th isn't my marker. My marker is the day before, the 6th, Friday the 6th of October, because on that day, this particular gentleman, Michael Lavalette, came to my house for a cup of tea, and he had just moved back from Liverpool, and we were discussing the future, and that future was the future where I was telling him that I'm not really going to do much. I'm not going to be involved in many things, and my priorities have really changed. And since then, it feels like we have been out demonstrating virtually every other week. We have actually stood for an election, a general election, and I was the agent. Now that brings back memories as well. So we've done that, but I mean, I'm not. You want to smile and you want to laugh, but it's 425 days of sheer madness, and for me, and we've got speakers. I'm not a speaker. I'm just going to chair this, and I'll be gone in a minute or two, and I'll just introduce the speakers. But I did choose the title of this event because everyone has seen. No one needs to know what is happening, because this genocide is a genocide not in the history books. We've watched this live stream to our phones, and that in itself is unprecedented. And Ismail said one thing today, and that kind of brought it home to me, and he said that a school had been bombed. And did you see that in the news today? Did anyone read that anywhere? Did it come up anywhere? And there was a time before these 425 days that would have been the main news. Would it not have been the main news? Would we have not had an emergency demonstration on the flag market to do something about it? We'd be full today if this was the first thing that happened, what was today, but we're not, and we're in a different period, and so this is a time to reflect, and we're going to reflect and think about what it's kind of meant for these individuals. And for me, I mean, what can I say? It's been a very hard year to deal with this, and you know, is there normality in life? There's certain things that I try not to do. I won't go to big dinners and that, because how can we enjoy a dinner and they're being starved? So I try to avoid. People don't do charity big function dinners anymore, and why should they? And I've noticed that within our community that the kind of banter that you see on WhatsApp statuses, that on football, that's kind of died away, because that's not important anymore. So just in our lives, we've adjusted to recognise that there is a genocide. One of the other things for me is that I write. I only kind of write kind of social media writing and a bit of a blog or something, but people tell me you don't write anymore, and the only things you do write about is the genocide. Well, what else can I write about? What else do you want me to think about? What else do you want me to talk about? If you want me to talk about anything else, I'm not really too bothered. So sorry, it's a sullen kind of thing, but that's the way it is for us at the moment. But anyway, We've got 3 speakers, 15 minutes. That takes us to about an hour. If it's less than an hour, we may take some questions. Okay. So I'll hand over to the first speaker. He doesn't need any introduction, especially in Preston. Our Preston Independent candidate, Michael Lavalette.
All over the place. I'm going to offer a little bit of reflection over the last year, but also think about where we need to go forward as well. But I think it is right to take a bit of a pointer and think about the last year. Mukhtar started off by saying that I went to meet him on the 6th of October. I'd just come back, and he said, apart from Palestine, I probably won't do so much. So we might not be in contact as much. My partner's here, Laura, she'll tell you that he's never off the phone, never off the phone. So one of the positive things about the last year is that Mukhtar and Ismail and many of the people in here are in regular contact with each other as we've rebuilt our movement in Preston. But it's right to think about the bigger picture. So all of us now know that over this last year, this last 15 months, we have watched on our screens unfold a genocide. And the interesting thing, as Mukhtar said, is that it wasn't covered in the mainstream papers today, and that's true, the mainstream media, that's true. But of course, we no longer go to the BBC and the ITV for our news. We know that social media will report these things. And I always use my dad as a marker for this. My dad's 85, I think, and comes from a very traditional Labour background. When I first got involved in Palestinian politics in 1982, it was one issue that me and my mum and dad sort of disagreed with, because he was of a generation that had come through the war, and there was the Holocaust and the horror of that, and he couldn't quite get beyond that. He changed his position by the late 1980s when he went to the whole of land, and then he saw the reality and he changed his position on that. But he's very mainstream Labour and all those kind of things. But over the last 15 months, as I talked to him, it's quite a dramatic shift. He doesn't watch BBC News anymore, right? He watches Al Jazeera. That's my dad, my 85-year-old mainstream Labour dad, watching Al Jazeera, because he said, well, you don't get the news on BBC. If you want to find out what's going on, you go to Al Jazeera. So one of the interesting things is that we have used and accessed those alternative media sources on social media, or Al Jazeera, or the various news channels that you do, because we don't trust the BBC, we don't trust the ITV, and I think that gives them a long-term problem, in terms of the idea formers in our society, because people go and check things out, go at the web and do those kind of things. And as we've done that, we know the reality. The reality is that they have bombed mosques and churches. Not just mosques, but mosques and churches. We saw on the BBC when they bombed their churches, the representatives of the State of Israel saying that's not true because there's no churches in Gaza, because if Hamas knew that there was Christians there, they would be thrown off the roof, or some ludicrous thing that she said. Simply not true. One of the oldest churches in the whole of land was in Gaza. There was a Christian community in Gaza. I don't know if they're still there, because I don't know who is left in Gaza in terms of those numbers. But this was never about Muslims and Jews. This was always about the expansion of the State of Israel. And the victims were Muslims, yes. Christians, yes. Hamas, yes. But if you were in the PFLP or Fatah, or if you were non-aligned, it didn't really matter to the Israelis. You were a Palestinian, you were a legitimate target. And that is what they continue to do. And that's one of the things that we have learned over the last year. So they have bombed indiscriminately mosques, churches, schools, hospitals, towns, cities, villages. The whole of northern Gaza has been flattened. And yet, as they have done that, they told us that they would go in and that they would get rid of Hamas, and that was their objective. And yet, as they've done that 15 months later, they still haven't managed to defeat Hamas. Hamas are still active in the north of Gaza. I can't get my head quite around how that's possible, because it's completely flattened, and yet they still haven't done that. And the toll that it's taken on Israel in terms of troops is higher than they expected. And the crisis that it's generated inside Israel is far deeper than the Israeli state is willing to admit. There are those who campaign for peace because they want to get the hostages out. There are those who campaign because they want it to go even further and faster. There are those who say that Netanyahu isn't strong enough, i.e. doesn't go far enough. There are those who say that he goes too far. Israeli society is a deeply divided society, and that crisis has grown over the last 15 months. one of the things that they don't tell us, that over the last 2 months, for the last 2 months running, there have been more Jewish people left Israel than have attempted to go. It's now perceived to be not a safe place for Jews. It's perceived to be not a place where Jews want to make their home, and they are leaving. Now that's a huge disaster for the state of Israel, because its claim is that it is the Jewish homeland. Its claim is that it's the place where Jews are safe. Its claim is it's the only place that Jews can go in the world to avoid any conflicts and have that safety. And that's simply not true. And the reason it's not true is because of the expansionist policies of the Zionist entity and the Zionist state in that way. So the first thing today to say in reflection is, yes, we've noticed the horror. We know that because we go to our media, and we know that is truly horrific, but we also recognise that is not going completely the way that Israel wants, and it's opening up all sorts of crises within Israel itself. And I think that's something to do for us to hold on to. The second thing that I want to reflect on is our side globally and our side within Britain as well, because looking around the room, most of us have all been in fact everybody here has been on our demonstrations in Preston, and many of us have been on the demonstrations in London, and some of us have been on the demonstrations in London on several occasions. There's been 22 national demonstrations. We have taken 20 coaches, we've taken more than 20 coaches, but on 20 occasions we have had coaches going from Preston. And on the way back on Saturday night, I was trying to calculate what that meant. And for those that were there on Saturday, you'll have heard this, but there's 20 national marches, and Stop the War have put on 20 coaches, and our average has been about 50 people per coach. That's 2,000 people have gone from Preston to London in 15 months for demonstrations. That's hugely significant, because it's 5 hours there and 5 hours back for us. People have to pay out money to go down there, and yet we've taken 2,000 people. Now, some of those 2,000 are the same people. So there's a woman, Christine from Lancaster, she's been in all 20. But every single time we go, there are people who are going for the first time. So I tried to work out how many people in total, and I worked it out that I think there's about 500 people have gone. 2,000 trips, but 500 people who have gone. I don't think in Preston's history there has ever been such a sustained transport of people from Preston to London to protest at national demonstrations. And that's because we're part of a really quite unique social movement. I first met Mukhtar and Ishmael and many people in this room 23 years ago, when Stop the War was set up in 2001, and then in 2003 the big demonstration against the Iraq War, and we had some massive demonstrations in 2003. We had 2 million people march through the streets on the 15th of February 2003. That was the first time that I met Mukhtar, as we took a train and 6 coaches to do that. But it wasn't at the same level of sustainability that we've had for the last 15 months. The other examples that we might start to compare it with would be the campaign for women's suffrage in the run-up to the First World War. So the suffragettes and the suffragists that people have heard about, because they were a long, sustained social movement that kept that pressure for women's right to vote going for a number of years. I think we're in that terrain. And if you want to go back even further, we're probably in the terrain of the Chartists. And in Preston we've got the monument to the killing of the strikers in Preston as part of the Chartist movement. But the Palestine movement of the last 15 months is on a scale with those kind of movements. And each and every one of you should be hugely proud to be part of that movement and part of that campaign to raise awareness about what's going on in Palestine, and to make sure that we're not silent in the face of the genocide that is taking place. So we've been down to 20 trips, and in between times we've had our marches in Preston, and we've had art projects, and we've had books published by poets and writers. I see Alan sitting at the back, and he said he's posed there. Mixed in his art projects, I'll mix over here. We've done all of those things. There's been fundraising activities. We've managed to get money into both Gaza and into the West Bank, and all of that's happened from around Preston. But people might say, well, but what has the marching done? Because we still haven't stopped the killing in Gaza. And of course we haven't stopped the killing in Gaza. But I want to reverse that. If you think about it, the killing in Gaza meant that we as a protest movement in Britain and across the globe were taking on the state of Israel and their backers. And who are their backers? The most powerful states in Western imperialism. America, Britain, Germany, the European Union, all back Israel. If we think that we were going to beat them by having one demonstration, we've learnt the hard way that it takes more than one demonstration to beat them. They're incredibly powerful. But then, let's not lose the woods for the trees. Because let's think about the last year and what we have achieved. First of all, there's the obvious ones that I've mentioned before at marches and all the rest of it. But there was that occasion, just over a year ago, when Suella Braverman went head to head with the movement and said, it's either them or me, but I'm not letting them march. And to be fair, some people in the Stop the War coalition and the Palestine Solidarity movement were facing prison that week, one of them's here, because the threat was there that if you march at that time, then we were going to arrest those that called it. So that was people like Chris and those at the leadership there. That's how extreme that was, that's how tense that was. And we said we're not moving an inch, we're going to march. 850,000 of us turned up to march. We weren't in the wrong, we didn't step back, and within the space of a few weeks, Suella Braverman was gone. We took out Suella Braverman when she went face to face with us. So that's one high point that we had in that period. Then there was, of course, there was the elections. We got 5 independent pro-Gaza MPs elected. That is, in my estimation, I think that is the biggest left of Labour return that we have ever seen in this country. If you think about other periods, I was involved in Respect way back in 2006, and that was hailed as a huge breakthrough because we got 1 MP. George Galloway was the one. Well, we get 5 this time. Or if you go back to the Second World War, the Communist Party had 2 MPs. Willie Gallagher and Phil Pratten were elected, but that was only 2. We got 5. And in the first past the post-electoral system, that's a huge breakthrough. That was on the back of the movement of solidarity with Palestine. We shouldn't lose the woods for the trees. We achieved that. We have got 5 MPs representing us in Parliament at this point in time. So Suella Braverman and the MPs. But then think about the other things. So again, let me go back to my dad. That first time that I marched in 1982, we thought we had a great Palestine demonstration through Glasgow. It was just after Israel had invaded Lebanon. There had been the siege of Beirut for 60 days, and we must have had 5,000 people in that demonstration. We were a tiny minority in British society in 1982. It was the far left and it was some people in the Muslim community, but it wasn't a general position of support for Palestine in 1982. Look what we've done now. In the opinion polls, after opinion poll, after opinion poll, something like 75% of the population of Britain want an immediate ceasefire. Huge victory. Where's that come from? Because people have been protesting week after week and raised and maintained themselves on the streets and put that pressure on the government, and 75% want a ceasefire. 65% think we should stop arming Israel. That's moved over the last 15 months. So people have come towards us even in that, which is quite a significant position, that we should even go so far as to stop arming Israel. And on those indicators, do you view Palestine more favourably or Israel more favourably? We're again up in the high 60s in terms of that. In terms of the political culture, in terms of people's ideas of support, we have gone, in my lifetime, in 1982, from being a tiny minority who support Palestinian rights to being the immense majority in this country who stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine. The problem is that our governments and the ruling elites don't listen to us, but we have put that in the agenda. We have put the situation where the majority are with us, and we have to keep on making sure that we stay on the streets and we keep on protesting until they stop the killing in Gaza and until Israel stops their expansionist project. So if we think about what we've achieved in this last 15 months, I think we should be proud of what we've done, but we need to keep on going and we keep on marching in the streets. And of course, if you think about that being the case in Britain, the other thing that we need to say about the Palestine movement, it is an international movement of solidarity. We march on the streets of Preston, but we march on the streets of Delaware. I'm not quite sure where Delaware is, it just popped into my head, but you know what I mean. Okay, or Canada, or the Philippines, or Australia. My daughters are in Melbourne just now, and there are regular demonstrations in Melbourne, in Auckland, in... So right across the world, this is a global movement of solidarity with Palestine. And again, this is a huge problem in the long term for the Zionist project. They are isolated. They are a minority in terms of global opinion. If you look at every time it goes to the UN, you look at the number of states that vote against them. Of course, nothing ever happens because the powerful states of the United States and usually the UK, use their right of veto to make sure that nothing goes through. But nevertheless, if you take the veto away, the vast majority of the world stand with Palestine against Israel. And it's the same with the decisions of the ICC and now the fact that he is wanted. What a great victory that was for our side. Now, I'm not telling you that in the next week or the next fortnight or the next month or the next 2 months, the chances are that Ben Gvir and Netanyahu are going to be in The Hague and that we're all going to sit and watch our television as he's sent down to whatever his place in hell will be. That won't happen. I don't expect him to be arrested. But on the global stage, this is a massive defeat for Israel and their backers in the West European societies and in America. For the international courts to be saying that there is a genocide going on, that ethnic cleansing is taking place, that these people are warmongers, is an absolute catastrophe for them, because they want to say that they are in the right morally, that they want to say that they're the only democracy in the Middle East, that they want to say that they're fighting terrorists, and actually nobody believes any of that. And they now find themselves as part of a minority current. So, I think those are the things that we've achieved over the last 15 months as part of a global movement to challenge the power of Israel and America and Western imperialism. But of course, they continue. Our government continues to arm Israel, and hopefully Keir Starmer will face his day in court for that. The American state continues to arm Israel, because without the arms from America and Britain, Israel couldn't continue with their war. So our governments and its ruling classes in each of our countries continue to do that, but we have shown that when we stand together, we can shift the agenda, we can shift the debate, we can isolate Israel, we can push them back, and we have to keep on doing that for 15 months, for 16 months, for 17 months, for however long it takes. Because as I've said on many occasions, as long as they continue to bomb, murder, kill and commit genocide in Gaza, then we have a responsibility to make sure that we don't give up the fight, that we stand with the Palestinian brothers and sisters, that we march, that we protest, that we do whatever we can to raise the banner of Palestine, stand in solidarity, because at one point in the future, it might not be a month or 2 months or 3, but at some point in the future, Israel will fall and Palestine will win. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's passionate as ever. Thank you very much indeed for that speech. I'll hand over to our next speaker, Tracy, Delaney, who's the Northwest UNISON's International Committee's Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invite to speak tonight next to Chris and Michael tonight. And I'd like to say, from a trade union point of view, UNISON's a proud affiliate of Stop the War, and I regularly speak at the Stop the War demos which take place in Manchester. I think just reflecting on some of the figures that have been mentioned today, today is the 423rd day since October the 7th, and so far there's 44,502 people killed, 105,454, there's too many numbers in that for me, it has been wounded during this time, and there's 11,000 people missing still to this day, and that's the figures as of today, and that's from the Middle East Monitor. As it's been introduced, I'm the chair of the Northwest International Committee for UNISON, but I'm also a local branch secretary in Oldham local government branch. And just touching on what Michael said, this year Labour lost control of Oldham Council because 5 Labour candidates defected and stood as independents on a Palestine campaign, so it is making a difference, and that's not been seen before, and we've got to keep up that work, and I work closely with those candidates. I'm going to give you a bit of a talk around the trade unions and what we can do as trade unionists within what's going on in Palestine and what we do within UNISON in particular. So we do work closely with Palestine Solidarity Campaign on international solidarity work, and also we have a lot of work at the moment on the divestment from the local government pension schemes. which anyone who does work in a local authority, is your money, your pension is being invested into companies that are complicit in this genocide. So we've got a live petition at the moment, in particular in Merseyside and Greater Manchester, to divest from that. And we're also very active in the European Trade Union Network for Justice for Palestine. And we attend that meetings with our comrades across Europe who, like us, are standing up against what's going on. So we've got a long-standing history with Palestine, Palestinian workers and activists from around the world. And I think the most important thing for me is UNISON is an anti-war union, and we stand for peace no matter where that is. So we're very active within the BDS movement, which is the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, and we encourage branches and members to support this. And as I've just mentioned, the divestment from the pension schemes and divesting away from arms sales is key to this work. And we currently have the live petition and the model letters, which have gone to those members that are in those areas. As I said, it's Merseyside and Greater Manchester at the moment, and we're opening to widen that out to other pension funds to sign. So we're calling for this government to end such deals I've mentioned, and the immediate recognition of Palestine, and an immediate ceasefire across the region, and to uphold international law and allow full humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which is still currently being blocked by Israel. And I think it's been clear for a long time that the Israeli government wants a regional war, and it's been on the agenda for a while, and I know Michael's touched upon that. This didn't just start on October the 7th, this has been building over many, many years. And the election of Trump makes it more likely. But after a year of genocide and recently the widespread destruction and devastation in Lebanon, which has been carried out by US weaponry, there's no genuine indications from the Democrats either, should they have won the election, that they will be any different. And they publicly declared the intention to annex the West Bank, which should send shockwaves through the international community. But it has long been clear that this has been happening all along, creeping in over recent years and massively escalated over the past 12 months. And the intent has always been the same. And our government has been complicit. The suspension of only 8% of all arms licences is an absolute disgrace, and we're living in extremely dangerous times. The world appears to be embroiled in a new era of open war leading to death, destruction, and the displacement of peoples, and the very real danger of even greater escalation. Most people around the world overwhelmingly want their governments to work towards peaceful solutions to global disputes, including most people here in Britain. But as we know, our simple aspirations are not always reflected by the actions of our governments. We welcome the long overdue decision of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to issue the arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and Gallant, the former Minister of Defence, for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed since October 2023. In its public statement, the ICC says there are reasonable grounds to believe that both men bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare, the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts, and the war crime of intentionally directing attack against the civil population. The ICC further states that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both individuals intentionally and knowingly deprived the civilian population of Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, including food, water, medicine, medical supplies, fuel and electricity. And disgracefully, Keir Starmer initially argued that Israel had a right to carry out these despicable crimes. Just last week, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy avoided demands from MPs to sanction Israel's fascist ministers, saying he acknowledges the strength of feeling. Well, for me, Foreign Secretary, we acknowledge your complicity in the genocide of the Palestinian people, and it won't be forgotten. The British government has previously stated its support for the independence of the ICC, and although it has now said it has an obligation to pass the arrest warrants onto our courts, it must be unequivocal that Netanyahu and Gallant will be arrested if they ever try to set foot on British territory. These arrest warrants must only be the start. All those responsible for Israel's crimes against humanity and war crimes must also be held to account. And Israel is currently standing trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice, and the same court had already ruled that Israel is guilty of the crime against humanity of apartheid. Despite all these breaches of international law, we are still supplying arms to Israel, and we call for an end to all licences for arms traded with Israel. And last week's letter to David Lammy from over 60 MPs from 7 different parties calling for comprehensive sanctions is long overdue, but it must also be welcomed. We need sanctions now on all those individuals or entities who have made statements inciting genocide against Palestinians. Just last week as well, Canadian health workers held a press conference on their return from Gaza, calling out their own government for their complicity in genocide, stating Israel has killed over 18,000 children. Every university has been destroyed and most hospitals have been destroyed, and we unanimously agree Israel is committing a genocide. Within UNISON, we encourage all members to continue their efforts with the BDS movement, and this is having a real impact. And again, just last week, Puma officially stopped being the sponsor of the Israeli Football Association, almost 12 months after leaking it to the press, that when the contract expires in December 24, they will not renew it as it was no longer able to sustain the growing pressure and wanted out. That's clearly an illustration of the impact of the global boycott Puma campaign. And for me, it's quite simple. As trade unionists, we are pro-peace. We want to stop current wars and oppose future wars. That's it. It's as simple as that. For our members who overwhelmingly work in public services, it is never in their interest to support the government's drive to war. And while successive governments use taxpayers' money to increase military spending year on year, our public services face a severe funding crisis. More money spent on military activities and war means less money for our essential public services, our communities and the most vulnerable in society who rely on these services. A recent UNISON Commission report, Councils Under Pressure, which can be found on UNISON's website, found that councils face a collective funding shortfall of over £3.5 billion for the financial year 24-25, and the cumulative figure will rise to nearly £7 billion by next year. We all know about the multiple crises within our NHS, huge staffing vacancies, spiralling workloads, and a record patient backlog. The funding crisis is replicated across the entirety of our public services. But isn't it odd that whilst there never seems to be money for our essential public services, the government always finds money for war and militarisation? As trade unionists, we have a duty to be loud in our opposition to all wars, increase military expenditure and the military industrial complex. We need that opposition to all wars. We must use our organisal strength as unions, not just UNISON, anyone that's in any union, use that strength, which is constantly under attack, to insist on UK foreign policy, which promotes peace and social justice. Many of our unions are affiliated to the Labour Party, and we must use our resources through our Labour-linked channels to keep the pressure on, to push our agenda and to make sure Palestine does not fall off the agenda. What can we do as public sector workers and trade unionists? Well, as trade unionists working within the public sector, I believe it's essential that we continue to campaign for an increase in public service funding and oppose any increased military expenditure. What the trade movement should be doing is actively campaigning for the UK government to commit to work for peace and for diplomatic solutions to international disputes and crises. The UK needs to once and for all end its role in fomenting and inflaming conflicts worldwide. Last week, we've seen workplaces from across the country holding workplace days of action in support of Palestine, which was backed by the TUC. These type of activities are making Palestine a topic of conversation within workplaces where it hasn't been before. And these workplace activities are building awareness and support, and we've got to keep building this and attending the demos. And I've heard from Michael and I've seen it because I've been myself in the London demos, the Manchester demos. We haven't faded. They thought we'd have gone away by now. We haven't. We are turning up week in, week out. And I think just from my comrades who I do speak to in the West Bank, you know, it's noted what we're doing in the UK, and it means so much to Palestinian people. And they said that is what they want us to do: keep applying pressure and keep turning up on the streets, because that is giving them hope as well, that they're not alone. We're well placed as trade unions to have the tools and resources to do this, and we have a duty ourselves to educate members within schools, public services, and in fighting the far right in general, and to uphold international law, and to let people and members know how important it is to have international solidarity with workers around the world, because I get it quite a bit from, well, what you're doing international work for when you're in Oldham, you're in Manchester, what about us? I'm like, the workers across the world, no matter what country we're in, we have very similar struggles. We're all being oppressed by capitalism and imperialism, and a worker here is the same as a worker anywhere else, and as trade unionists, there should be no difference in that. But that's what we should be educating our members in, why international solidarity is a big part of our work. And I think what should go without saying is we need to strengthen our support for organisations who are campaigning for peace and to end the war, and also, you know, strengthen our affiliations and work with Stop the War Coalition. I am proud that in the North West and in Manchester we're affiliated, and we do a lot of work with Stop the War, and I like to see that replicated across the country. But all those organisations working together with the same agenda is making a difference, and we've got to keep that up. So thank you for having me.
Big personal thank you to Tracy for a fantastic speech and for all the work she does. I mean, I don't work for Lancashire anymore. I wish she was the chair for Lancashire when I was here, because we'd have loved it if you were doing all that work here as well. So thank you for all the work that you do for your union and your solidarity with the Palestinian campaign. Thank you. Just a couple of announcements, and then I'll kind of move on to our next speaker. And I'm kind of replicating things really, because if you all join the ceasefire group, that's the only announcement I need to make, because it all goes on there. So if you're not on the ceasefire group, speak to one of us, and we can join you up onto that, and you'll know what's happening. So the things that are currently in the pipeline, this Saturday, the 7th of December, at the Audley Sports Centre in Blackburn, there's a showing of Where Olive Trees Weep. It's £5 a ticket, and it's a critically acclaimed film which you can go and see in Blackburn on Saturday. On the 13th and the 14th of December, there's an art exhibition with pieces all about the genocide and its meanings. This is at the Gravesore Centre at Lancaster. So that's the Gravesore Centre for Saturday the 13th and the 14th of December. And of course, the next national demonstration, you can get tickets from Michael, which is on the 18th of January after Christmas. Okay, so we'll what are we doing for time? We're 8:15, so we're doing well for time. We'll move on to our final speaker, and it's a real pleasure to have him. We did have a debate as to whether we've had Chris here before. Have we had you before, Chris?
I don't think you have.
Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, it's okay. Well, it's Michael's fault if it isn't. It's not my fault. I thought we did, but never mind. We'll live with that one. We've got you now anyway. So our next speaker is one of the founder members of the Stop the War Coalition. He continues to be one of the National Steering Committee members, and is currently the chief steward of the national marches for Palestine when these happen in London as well, which sounds like a big job really, Chris. But, anyway, our next speaker and our final speaker, Chris Nineham. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Mokhtar, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight and for inviting me finally. I suppose the thing that I find so disturbing about the situation is that for Netanyahu, for Biden, for Starmer, there simply are no red lines. It's like nothing is off the table. Burning children alive, burying whole communities in rubble, stopping aid getting into areas where people are clearly starving, risking war with Iran. It's as if the Western leaders have lost all sense of humanity, all sense of rationality. And in the process, I think it's important to recognise they are also losing all legitimacy around the world. But it is, as the speakers have said, the last year has seen a kind of a real sea change in the way geopolitics has been operating. It wasn't great before, but the whole myth of a rules-based order, the whole idea of civilizational war being conducted by the West, of a war for humanity or democracy, these things are now completely shredded as myths. Now, no one around the world, or very, very few around the world, can any longer believe them. And I think it's worth questioning for a moment, what is the driver, what is the impulse behind this apparent madness and irrationality? And I would say that it's not primarily, as some people think, about an Israel lobby. I think it goes much deeper than that. There is an Israel lobby, there has been for quite a long time, and it has some influence. But the West and Britain and the US's support for Israel is historically goes back many decades, and I think the situation is much more deeply rooted in the politics of the West than being something where politicians or military leaders are kind of persuaded by foreign powers to follow a particular path. What is really going on here is that Israel is regarded by the Western powers as being essential to their project to dominate the Middle East. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. It's important because it underlines how crucial the movement in the West is, because the truth is that without Western support, without US backing for Israel, it couldn't continue its aggressions and its adventures in the region for even a day. So it's not true, as the liberal papers and the liberal media sometimes like to say, that Israel is off the leash. That's not what's going on here. Because the reality is that they may be doing some things that Biden and co don't particularly like in a tactical sense. But if the US, if Britain, if the Western powers wanted to stop them, they have the leverage. And therefore, it's not a case of the Western powers being negligent or colluding in what is going on. They are participating. This carnage, this genocide, this destruction is on our leaders more than anything. And I think it's very important to get that across to people, and partly because it begins to explain why the struggle is so hard and why it is that we've marched 22 times and still Keir Starmer and the rest of the British establishment almost in unison say they're standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel. It explains why the struggle is going to be prolonged. Why, as Michael says, it's not going to be a few demonstrations. It's going to be a sustained struggle to actually change a centrepiece of the imperial project of the most powerful countries in the world. And in that sense as well, it's having that understanding of the situation also points in the direction of the importance of us connecting what is going on in the Middle East in our minds and in our campaigning with the wider drive to war and the wider sense of growing militarism and growing conflict and danger in the world as we look around it today. Because, you know, it is a very scary place now. And I would say that the same impulses that are forcing or creating a situation where the West is arming Israel are creating a situation where the West is arming Ukraine. In the case of Israel, it's about dominating the Middle East. In the case of Ukraine, it's about pushing back Russia, who is regarded as being one of the main enemies, and dominating Eastern Europe. And so we need to put together a picture of a growing drive to war around the world. And these wars are, and these kind of, at the moment, essentially proxy wars, but they are massively destabilising the world. They're actually creating a situation where the world is dividing into armed camps and massively destabilising the situation, whereby, for example, we're now seeing in Syria a regeneration, a reigniting of the civil war, because Turkey has decided that Russia is preoccupied in Ukraine, Iran is preoccupied with Israel. This gives them an opportunity to try and make some gains against Assad, even possibly destabilise or topple Assad. So you can see how the West pushing these wars is creating armed conflicts, which then actually destabilise all sorts of different parts of the world. And actually today there was martial law declared in South Korea. Now there's all sorts of reasons for that, but one of them is that the right-wing president claimed that left-wing elements in the government were pro-North Korea. So even that development, that alarming development in South Korea, where democracy was at least temporarily suspended completely, is partly a product of this growing confrontation, this growing sense of conflict around the world. And so this is why, as well as strengthening the Palestine movement, which is absolutely crucial and is the main discussion tonight, I think it's very, very important that we do the kind of things that Tracy's talking about, which is that we do need to build a movement against war, against intervention, against militarism more generally. And this is important for world peace mainly. It's important for the future of our planet. It's important for the future of our children. But it's also about the kind of priorities, the kind of society we want to live in. Because every penny spent on arming Ukraine, every penny spent on arming Israel is a penny that's not spent on our crumbling schools and our crumbling social services and the kind of things that people so desperately need in our society. And it is absolutely sickening to see a Labour government taking the view that they can't keep pensioners warm in the winter, that they can't pay child benefit to families that have more than 2 children, but they can say that really there is no limit to the amount of weapons that they will pay for. There is no limit to the amount of arms they will produce, and that they want to make sure that defence spending, so-called, which is really about projecting British power and US power around the world, is the one area where a massive expansion is regarded as being kind of all right. And these are terrible priorities. These are priorities we have to fight in a general way. And we do have to link the struggles to do that, I think. I guess the question then arises, what would it take? What would it take to create a situation where our government and the British establishment generally said enough is enough, and that this has to stop, and that this genocide can no longer be supported? And I guess the answer to that is that we need to build a movement with such social weight and such power that we can make this war and the supporting of this war unworkable. They're attacking our movement massively, actually, and this is one of the things that is quite disturbing about the situation. Journalists are being pro-Palestine journalists are being arrested, students are being suspended, activists are being lifted from demonstrations for wearing T-shirts that the police don't like. There's a really nasty attack on civil liberties, an attack particularly on the Palestine movement at the moment, and it's something that we have to resist. And certainly I think we should say we're going to take no lectures from the police forces of this country about hate crime, when up and down the country there are thousands and thousands of officers who are suspended for sexist behaviour, for racist behaviour, for misogyny, for sexual assault, and for actual racist attacks. So we really shouldn't listen to their attempts to demonise our movement, which, as you know, is a completely peaceful movement as a whole. But I think we should also recognise that these attempts to demonise us, these attempts to criminalise and marginalise us, are really desperate, and they're not a sign of strength. They're actually a sign of weakness. They're actually a sign of the fact that they are losing the argument. Actually, it's they who are marginalised. It's the people in this country concentrated in the establishment, concentrated in the managements of this of institutions in the country, concentrated at the top of the media, concentrated in Parliament, concentrated in the offices of the top management. They are the ones that are marginalised. There's only 5% of the British population who believe that what Israel is doing should be supported and is okay. And that's the kind of balance of the argument in society. And it's very important we're clear about that. It's very important we're clinical about exactly where we are and what we've achieved. And as Michael said, this is partly down to the movement. The fact that Israel is a pariah state internationally, the fact that the ICC has not just passed the judgment about genocide, but has now issued an arrest warrant, the fact that we got 5 independent MPs, pro-Palestine MPs, elected, the fact that the opinion polls are massively in our favour, all this is down more than anything to the demonstrations, the protests, the direct action, the public meetings, the massive, unprecedented level of activity we have seen up and down this country. And imagine what it would be like if we hadn't had this response. Imagine how bleak the world would look if there hadn't been this resistance. And it is absolutely crucial, and it is an incredibly inspiring movement. And we have to think now, and I think there is a discussion going on, and it would be great to hear from some of you about this, but there is a discussion going on about where we go from here and about taking the movement forward. And I just want to say a couple of things about that to end on. First, I think it is important to recognise the achievements that we have made. They wanted to make BDS illegal, if you remember. Just a couple of years ago, there was a campaign that was launched to do that. BDS is going from strength to strength. They wanted to ban our demonstrations. As Michael said, it was actually us that unseated a Home Secretary rather than, and we march where we want to march and when we want to march. They wanted to create a situation where we were regarded as criminalised, as I said, and we are actually winning the argument. And that's very, very important as a first step. The second thing I want to say is that I don't think we should underestimate the power that these demonstrations have. People say, oh, we need to do more direct action, we need to escalate. I think we do need to escalate, and I'll come on to that, but don't in any way play down or underestimate how important the massive demonstrations are, not just in London, but the London demonstrations are particularly important because that's where government is, that's where the decisions are made, that's where the Foreign Office is, that's where the Defence Ministry is. And they do pay attention. And in a way, those demonstrations are a form of massive direct action because those demonstrations bring the centre of London to a halt every 2-3 weeks. And they make London a centre of resistance. And it struck me just on Saturday. It's an incredible thing, really, that in the face of this propaganda campaign, in the face of this political repression and the police attempts to limit our powers to demonstrate, we are still marching from Park Lane through the centre of the West End, down Whitehall to Downing Street, where there's a massive stage with Palestinian songs singing out loud with a Palestinian flag raised above the platform as people march towards the stage. They have been defeated in their attempt to keep us out of the areas of the centre of power, and that is humiliating for them. They have now got themselves in a situation where, thanks to the ICC decision, the British government is on the one hand saying publicly they stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, they are arming Israel to the teeth still, and yet they have to accept that if the Israeli Prime Minister came to Britain, they would need to arrest him. Now that is an unsustainable situation. That is a situation which is indefensible in any serious way. And, that gives you some sense of the fact, not just that we have made progress, but that actually under the surface of the situation, you know, they're the ones that have the problem. Now it's hard to keep the faith in that kind of analysis really, because you know, they don't say publicly we've got a problem here. They keep, I mean, there's still a massive consensus in the British establishment, at least on the surface. But I believe that in all the institutions of British society, that the argument is going in our direction, and that there is a kind of fragility to the consensus over Israel and over Palestine. I thought it was interesting that 100 BBC journalists wrote a letter to the BBC management, admittedly anonymously, but nevertheless wrote a letter saying the coverage has got to change. We hear stories of journalists crying in the toilets because of what they're being made to do. You feel in lots of different walks of life that there is a gathering momentum, and on the day of action, the workplace day of action on Thursday, 200 cultural workers assembled outside the South Bank, which is the Royal Festival Hall, the sort of cultural centre on the South Bank of the Thames, to have a rally where they were speaking out, and there were lots of kind of quite big name artists and cultural people coming together there. I feel as if under the surface of events there is this bubbling up of the movement. There is this kind of the development of the movement from below. Now, it's not automatic, it's not certain how long this process is going to take, but I do genuinely believe that the level of isolation of the government and those that support the war mean that we can break them. And I want to end just by saying two things about how we can do that. One is to continue the mobilisations. I think that all the other campaigning activities that people are involved in depend on the demonstrations continuing, depend on the demonstrations actually growing. And the next demonstration on January the 18th is going to start at the BBC, and we're going to have a big protest at the BBC. We're going to get journalists outside the BBC. We're going to give a letter to the BBC management in front of tens of thousands of people and have a die-in outside the BBC. We're going to make a big protest at the beginning of that demonstration and then march down to central London. We want to make that demonstration in the new year a statement that this movement is not just not going away, but is actually growing. So please start the process now of mobilising for that demonstration. And the last thing I want to talk about is something that Tracy mentioned, which is the workplace days of action. Because we had another big set of kind of victories in a way over the summer, which was that the Palestinian ambassador to Britain, Hossam Zomlot, spoke at trade union conference after trade union conference, not in a fringe meeting, but on the floor of the conferences, and got massive standing ovations. In fact, at the TUC conference, which is regarded as being pretty much moderate, pretty right-wing in Labour movement terms, Hossam Zomlot got a bigger standing ovation than Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. Now that tells you something. The trade unions are the biggest voluntary organisations in British society, 6 million people. If we can get the trade unions on board in a serious way, then we can really start shifting things. And the fact of the matter is that the TUC actually backed the days of action because of the movement. It was like the movement erupted onto the floor of the trade union conferences, and that then forced the trade union leaders to back the Palestine movement. And we can now use that to get back into the workplaces and to build the movement at the grassroots and at the rank and file level. So I would say the last workplace day of action, because of all that, was way the best one we've had. It had the biggest rallies, it had the most workplaces involved, it had the biggest participation in the different workplaces that have happened. But one thing that would really scare the establishment is if this movement started to really take root in the workplaces. And if the next workplace day of action went from, there's sometimes very small things like a Palestine lunch or wear a badge or wear a keffiyeh day for Palestine. But if we could have that happening in thousands of workplaces up and down the country, and if we could move towards a situation where in the universities the students were starting to not just have encampments but actually occupy the administration buildings, and if we could have a situation where in some of the workplaces, people were moving in the direction of taking industrial action, even for half an hour, then we'd be moving towards the kind of movement that I think we need, which, as I say, is a movement that needs to make support and participation in this war unworkable for the British government. I think we can do it. We need to stay organised, and we need to broaden the movement, and I think we need to have that strategic sense of the demonstrations being central, but also let's take it into the working class, let's take it centrally into the universities and to the colleges, let's begin the process of disrupting society to end this genocide.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. I don't know about you guys, but after hearing these three, I feel reinvigorated, very much so. I mean, it's been 425 days, but yeah, I feel really kind of motivated by hearing all three of you speak out. Now, we are coming to the kind of end of the event now, and as decisive as Michael always is, giving me two options. So, we could probably do 10-minute questions if people have got questions, and I suppose it's kind of guided by yourselves if anybody's got questions. If not, we've got a question at the back. Has anybody else got a question? There's two questions. Right, well, so that's what we'll do. We'll take two. We'll take three. Go on if there's a third one. Is there a third one? No. Okay. If anybody thinks of a third one, then let us know. We've got two questions in the room. I'm not going to pass the mic because it's going to become too dangerous and might do something. But Ahmad, isn't it? Yeah, Ahmad. Do you want to just shout your question out?
Yeah, hi everyone. One other announcement which wasn't made and I'm not aware of is the independent councillors in Blackburn on Thursday are going to be putting a motion together. So it's the policy council meeting on Thursday night, and it's to have the chief executive and the leader of Blackburn Council to write to the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary with regards to Israel arms sales to be ceased. So any support from Preston, please come along. It's at 6 o'clock, so as many people will be there, it's great. My question really is look, for the past year and for the past 76 years, if not longer, British society and many people across the world have been speaking in favour of Palestine and the Zionist occupation taking place in the Holy Lands. We've been marching, we've been protesting, we've been writing letters, we've been doing a whole host of things which we would do in a democracy, or what we believe to be a democracy. But quite frankly speaking, as we know, Britain gave rise to the Zionist entity in 1917. Palestine Action has been mentioned, particularly whereby, and BAE Systems just across the road here between Preston and Blackburn in Salisbury, where there's blockades there. But besides doing the hard action, which of course not condoning any criminality.
Questions, can we move to the question?
My question is, the Zionist entity is going full on for their Greater Israel project. Syria, what's happening there is, I believe, is a psyop. It's distracting people away from what's taking place, continuing to take place in Gaza. So therefore, besides the hard action that Palestine Action are doing in these companies divesting, what else can we do?
Does anybody want to take? Take them all then. Go on. So what's your question? Just question, please, no speech.
Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Tracy, you mentioned that it's important for workers to come together across the globe, right? The importance of internationalism, with obviously capitalism being a global system. And Chris, you were talking about the sort of the militarism that's being ramped up at the moment. I mean, Keir Starmer's sort of raising so-called defence spending up to levels that weren't even seen under the Tories. So I guess my question would be, what is the sort of relationship between this push for imperialism and capitalism? And would there be a possibility going forward, really? I mean, we see that imperialism and this militarism is oppressing the people in Palestine, in Lebanon, and across the globe. Would there be a possibility of living in a free globe where we do see peace and we see the ending of this oppression under capitalism?
Okay, thank you. So is there a third question? No, we'll go with the two questions. Any takers? Yusuf, go on. Quick question.
Just a quick carrying on the genocide, 425 days of the past. Everybody here is horrified, and already I expect trying their level best to do what they can joining in the movements, the marches, the protests. The question is, what more can we do? Obviously, we're sharing across social media platforms information, especially away from the gutter press, from the alternative press, which actually live streams a lot of what is happening. So what steps would each of the speakers like to suggest we do when we go back home as individuals also to try and cement and support the movement to literally stop the genocide?
Thank you, Yusuf. Yeah. I think, yeah. Does anybody want to start or take it? Yeah. You want to go for it, Tracy?
Yeah, I'll just be quite quick really, because I think in relation to yourself with capitalism, imperialism and freedom, while that exists, no it won't, because that's how they thrive. I think from a trade union point of view and a worker view, I think our workers should be part of the trade unions, you know, whichever one's relevant within your workplace. And, you know, don't underestimate the power of the trade union and what they can do. So if you are in a union or a branch that isn't active within international work or whatever the issue may be, whether it's something here or whatever, as a member you've got a right to ask your branch to act upon it, and they need to take that with them and they need to go. Most unions have, in UNISON it's called a labour link, so that's the section of the column APF affiliated payers to the Labour Party. So they have more direct impact into Labour policy, and many unions, the national unions, have a similar structure. We need to put that pressure on our Labour link to have that say to change it. But I think in that summary, while there is capitalism and imperialism, I don't think there will be freedom in any kind of form, even just as workers, let alone in, you know, when we're looking at war. And I think just quickly, while it was, you know, it's summing up, but in the workplace days of actions, I've probably done about 6 head teachers' heads in recently in Oldham, because they wanted to ban people from having, you know, like a Palestine lanyard or anything Palestine on. So I've just provided the schools with watermelon symbols, so all the staff are walking out with watermelons on, and the head teacher like, they can't, I'm like, it's a piece of fruit, what's your problem? But things like that, it's making a difference. And when one school, it started off with one school, that's now gone to another, because they're like, oh no, they've done that there, and the union backed them. Because yeah, I will back them and I will keep doing it, but if your union isn't active and your branch isn't, make them, they're accountable to you. As the member, you hold the power within unions, and use it, because there's a lot of force in there and there's a lot of influence, especially while Labour's in power, to make an impact on their policies and their change, and it is having an impact, and it is causing quite a lot of issues for Labour internally as well, on where they stand with this, especially with MPs.
So I'll just come back to a couple of questions. The first one, I want to give an example of something that Tracy was saying and the impact that was having. We are planning to have on the 1st of February a Lancashire-wide educational event for Palestine. We've been planning this for 4 weeks, so each of the towns across Lancashire have sent a representative. We've talked about the kind of national speakers that would have local workshops. And 4 weeks ago, we spoke to Cardinal Newman College, and we found the perfect venue for it. So a venue which can take 500-600 people in the sports hall, and then we'd have workshops and all the rest of it. And today I got an email, it's the 4th email I've had from them, saying that the senior leadership team are still meeting to decide whether we can hire Cardinal Newman Hall. Right, 4 weeks it's taken them to come to a decision about whether we can do that. We've approached, before that we went to UCLan, and UCLan said, oh, we don't open at the weekend. That's not true. I live in Preston. I know they're open at the weekend. And we don't hire UCLan out, which makes them the only university in Britain at this particular moment in time that is not desperate for any extra finance. So UCLan wouldn't take us. We then went to the Guildhall, right, which is run by the council, and they told us that it was really only set up for cultural events, like rock events, and so they couldn't take us either. And Cardinal Newman have been 4 weeks. So there is that pressure to try and ban us or not give us the space. And to be honest with you, I partly understand where Cardinal Newman are coming from, because in January last year, many of you remember, we had Jeremy Corbyn up at an event, and we had it at the Muslim Girls' School, and it was a weekend, it was a private hire. Jeremy Corbyn came up, it was all about Palestine, and the following week Zionist pressure groups in Preston contacted the Department of Education, and they got a huge amount of hassle for letting out their halls. They didn't give it for an actual contract and letting out the halls, and then that's the kind of pressure that's coming from the state and from the pressure groups on the other side to do those things. So all those things are happening, but our job is not to give up on that and to keep on pushing back and to keep on making sure that we should have the right. We have the right to hire Cardinal Newman. These are public buildings. We should have the right to go into UCLan, and we should have the right to hold debates. My God, the universities are meant to be places of academic debate, of academic freedom. I worked in the university sector for 34 years, I think, 35 years. And under the Tories recently, there was legislation that came around, and we were constantly being told, you have to facilitate freedom of speech, because that's what they were saying, that we were trying to ban people from speaking. They were saying that students and lecturers were banning people from speaking, and you can't do that. They were talking about fascists. If fascists come, you're not allowed to stop them. They've got the freedom of speech. But when it comes to Palestine, suddenly we don't have the freedom of speech, and there's all this pressure about shutting us up and keeping us down. So we constantly have to challenge, we constantly have to keep on fighting those things. And the bigger question about what we can do is all of that and what we've spoken about tonight. All of that, and we keep on marching locally, we keep on marching nationally, we keep on the pressure for around BDS. Again, I was in UCU Union, which is the University Lecturers Union, and our pension scheme is USS. And for years we've been trying to argue for disinvestment in USS, and now that we've actually got movement on that because of years of trade union campaigning around Palestine. So in our unions, in our communities, we march, we pressure, we put pressure on around BDS, we don't buy McDonald's, we don't drink Coca-Cola, whatever it is that we continue and build that pressure to make sure that we're part of this broader movement, and that we bring the pressure on the political elites, we bring the pressure on the Labour Party until the point that they can no longer take it and they stop the support for the state of Israel.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. The point about capitalism and imperialism is an interesting one, because there are people around who suggest that because we are seeing, in a way, the decline of US power, and actually that is a factor that is driving the current situation, that US is still by far the biggest military power in the world, but it's economically in particular being very, very challenged, partly by China. And there are people who suggest that the move away from the kind of moment of US dominance towards a more, people talk about a multipolar world, a world where there are lots of regional powers and power is not so concentrated in the US, is likely to be a more peaceful one. Now, none of us have any nostalgia for the days 20 years ago when the US regarded itself as the world's policeman and an unchallenged hyperpower. But nevertheless, the idea that the moments of geopolitical shift where the world order changes is likely to be a peaceful one, I think is a dream, is a myth. Actually, if you look back to the history of the 20th century, the moments of colonial change, the moments when different imperialisms were challenged or were in decline and power was shifting from one to the other, were the moments of greatest danger and conflict. And I think it's important to understand that capitalism is a system of competing states that compete economically and also compete militarily. And this is one of the worst and most toxic things about the system under which we live. At the same time, I think it's also important not to underestimate the power that the anti-war movement has mobilised over the last 2 or 3 decades. The way I look at it is that in British society, certainly, there's a kind of ongoing struggle between essentially the governments and the foreign and the defence ministry and the Foreign Office, who are essentially trying to maintain this global projection of British military power, who are absolutely committed to the Atlantic Alliance, the so-called special relationship, and the vast majority of ordinary people in this country who basically want peace, who basically think that it's a massive waste of money to spend all these billions of pounds on weapons, and and not just a waste of money, but liable to make the world a much, much more dangerous place. And if you look back, people sometimes say ordinary people in Britain aren't interested in foreign policy. The truth of the matter is, the 2 biggest demonstrations probably in British history, certainly in the recent past, the February the 15th, 2003 demonstration against the Iraq War, and last November's 800,000 demonstration over Palestine, the 2 biggest demonstrations in recent British history have both been about foreign policy. So it's not true that people don't understand that foreign policy matters. It's not true that people don't understand in a colonial country like Britain that domestic policy and foreign policy are intertwined. They're one and the same. They're absolutely central to politics in this country. And I think we're fighting a kind of, in a weird way, there's a trench warfare over militarism. Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have been elected as leader of the Labour Party if he hadn't been one of the key speakers in that anti-Iraq war demonstration in 2003. They moved against Jeremy Corbyn in the most, undemocratic, backhanded, and very, very sort of typically British, but nevertheless decisive way, using anti-Semitism, using the whole question around Europe to destroy him. And they wanted to destroy him because he represented a strand of opinion in British society, which is that these wars shouldn't happen, which is that we should end the military spending, we shouldn't have nuclear weapons, and that we shouldn't be in the pocket of Washington. 13 million people voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, even though they all knew that's what he stood for, even though the Daily Mail and the Sun and all the other media attacked him for being a peacenik, hippie, all of this, an appeaser, a friend of Assad. Nevertheless, 13 million people defied all that and voted for them. That is the kind of scale of support that we still have. Those people are still around. Okay, some of them may have been disillusioned, but most of them will still be standing with us and still be agreeing with us. And I think that's the way we've got to look at this situation. It's not the case that we're being defeated or we're being isolated. It's the case of a battle over the soul of this country. What kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of values do we want to have in this society? And many, many people, probably the majority of people, agree with us. So when people say, and I'll end on this, when people say, what is it that we need to do? I think I'd say 2 things fundamentally. I agree with what the other speakers have said and what other people have said. In a sense, all resistance, all opposition, all campaigning is valuable, and we need to continue to do all of the different things that people are involved in. But just 2 things do strike me as being very important to say. One is, we have a big movement, a very big movement, but we can make it bigger. There's no reason why we should stop at a few 100,000. What we need to think about is, how do we actually close the gap between the hundreds of thousands of people who are marching and the millions of people who support us? And we mustn't get locked in our own silo of social media, Instagram and Twitter or whatever, X or whatever, and just, just be talking to ourselves. We've got to figure out, loads of people are starting to say those marchers are right and Keir Starmer's wrong. How do we get to them? We know when the next demonstration is on January the 18th. How do we tell everyone else the next demonstration is on January the 18th? I think we should be doing posters in shop windows, but also on bus stops and, get the stuff out there. I think we should be doing leaflets in the streets. I think we should be making announcements in lectures in universities. I think we should be trying to make sure every single union branch knows when the next demo is, a month in advance, and is being asked to put on coaches. Every single mosque, we should approach all the mosques. I'm sure the mosques are on board anyway, but maybe there are some that aren't mobilising. Let's go to them and say, why haven't you put on a coach for this? Because this is too important for us just to coast. We need to be thinking about how do we make the movement even stronger and even bigger. And the last point is, we've said this already, but I do want to re-emphasise it. I think taking the movement into the institutions is absolutely critical, because that's where people are during the day. People are at work. The vast majority of people are at work, and probably most of you work, not all of you, but certainly people who do, or you can go down to a local workplace. Let's make workplaces into bastions of pro-Palestine feeling. Now, I know there's a climate of fear. I know that managements are tough. I know that people are being disciplined and people are being threatened with discipline. But I think we have to challenge that climate of fear. I think we have to break it down. I think we have to, because as I say, I don't think it's a product of their strength. I think it's a symptom of their weakness. If they're being repressive, that's because they know they've actually lost the argument. If they're saying you can't talk about Palestine, it's because they know that if you did talk about Palestine, you'd be saying we support Palestine. Now, I can imagine a situation in different workplaces and different institutions, I'm not saying it'll happen overnight, where those walls could just come tumbling down. Because in any workplace, especially in an area like this, I'm suspecting that 80% of people at least would agree with us. So, we need to sort of break the ice a little bit. People say to me sometimes, the only time that I talk about Palestine at work is when someone says to me, what are you doing this weekend? Now, that's kind of, that tells you what's going on here. But I think we need to find ways of making sure that isn't the only time you talk about Palestine. And we need to be, clever about it. We need to be creative about it. We need to use the charity collections. We need to just use badges. We need to put, on our Zoom calls, we need to put Palestine on the backdrop. We need to think of all sorts of different ways of doing it. And let's get to a situation where the managers are just losing the plot, where the managers are just no longer able to keep it silent. Because it is an outrage that in universities and in schools and places of learning, in councils and places that have trade unions, they're saying we can't talk about the issue that has dominated the news for the last 15 months. We can't talk about a genocide. I think we just have to stand up to them and say, we're not taking this. We're supposed to live in a democracy. If we want to talk about Palestine, we're going to talk about Palestine.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Michael Lavalette, Tracy and Chris Nineham, thank you very much indeed for all that you've done, and your speeches have been excellent. So thank you all for coming as well. So thank you.